Legendary voices don't usually tremble, but in that quiet room, Gary Oldman's did, and for the first time in his long, brilliant life, he sounded like a man standing at the edge of something he could never outrun, finally ready to speak a truth that had been buried for decades. He sat alone beneath the soft amber glow of a single lamp, his face half in shadow, the way he always preferred it when a scene got too honest. At 70, his eyes held the weight of every character he had ever played, but also something deeper, something rawer, something that had nothing to do with acting. He took a slow breath and whispered that there are stories in Hollywood that don't die when the cameras stop rolling, stories that keep breathing inside you, waking you up in the middle of the night, asking you why you stayed silent when it mattered most. And then he said Rob Reiner's name, not loudly, not angrily, but with a softness that made it feel like a confession in a church after midnight. Gary spoke about how he and Rob had once shared long walks on sound stages after everyone else had gone home, talking about films, about family, about how fame could make you feel powerful and invisible at the same time. He remembered Rob laughing the way only a man who had seen both triumph and heartbreak could laugh. And he remembered thinking how rare it was to meet someone in Hollywood who still believed stories could change people. But behind that laughter, Gary said, there was always a shadow, something Rob never quite let anyone see. It wasn't scandal, not in the cheap gossip sense, but a private sorrow that sat in Rob's eyes like a bruise. As Gary talked, his voice grew quieter, almost fragile. As he recalled the day, he realized how deep that sorrow went. It was years ago, during a project that brought together some of the biggest names in the industry, people like Jack Nicholson, Meryl. Gary paused for a long time before admitting that those words still echo in his head. He never got to hear everything Rob wanted to tell him. Life, illness, and the cruel timing of the world got in the way. And somewhere between all of that, secrets remained locked away, not because they were dangerous, but because they were too painful to let out. Gary said that's the truth people don't understand about Hollywood legends. It's not the scandals that break them. It's the love, the regrets, the moments they wish they could relive just one more time. That be why the time he reached this part of the story, his eyes were wet, though he never let a tear fall. He spoke about Rob's family, about the way his children would sit quietly in waiting rooms, pretending to be strong while their hearts were breaking. He spoke about how fame can't protect you from watching someone you love slowly slip away. And he confessed that he had carried a guilt so heavy it felt like a second skin, because he believed, in some small, terrible way, that he could have done more. The air in the room felt thick as Gary leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper now, saying that what Rob had wanted to share wasn't about blame or betrayal, but about forgiveness and the cost of silence. He said there are truths that don't explode when they come out. They simply ache, the way an old wound aches when the weather changes. And those are the truths that stay with you forever, haunting your quiet moments, reminding you of what you lost and what you never got to say. That he looked straight ahead, as if Rob were sitting there in front of him, and murmured that he was finally ready to tell that story, even if it hurt, even if it reopened wounds he had tried to keep closed for decades, because some promises don't die when the person you made them to is gone. They just get heavier with time. Gary took another slow BR. When Rob's condition worsened, the calls became less frequent. There were days when Gary would stare at his phone, willing it to ring, feeling like a child waiting for a voice that might never come again. He kept thinking about all the things Rob had given the world, the stories that had made people believe in love and hope, and he wondered how a man who had created so much joy could be facing so much fear alone. That thought, he said, was what finally broke something inside him. He talked about driving to the hospital one night through empty streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white, and feeling a kind of dread he had never felt before, not even on the darkest sets he had ever worked on. When he arrived, Rob was asleep, his face peaceful in a way that made Gary's chest ache. He sat there for hours, holding his hand, whispering apologies for all the times he hadn't been there, for all the conversations they never finished. He told Rob that he was loved, that his stories mattered, that his life had changed more people than he could ever know. And then there was a moment, so quiet it almost felt like it wasn't real, when Rob's eyes opened just a little. He looked at Gary, And for a second, it was like the years fell away, and he was the same man Gary had met long ago, full of fire and humor and complicated, beautiful contradictions. Rob tried to speak, his lips forming words that Gary could barely hear. But what he did catch has stayed with him ever since. Rob said something about truth and family, about how the hardest secrets are the ones you keep to protect the people you love. Gary's voice cracked as he admitted that he didn't understand it then. He squeezed Rob's hand and told him to rest, promising they would talk later, promising there would be another chance. That chance never came. Rob slipped back into sleep, and by morning, he was gone. He spoke about running into other actors who had known Rob, people like Tom Hanks and Sally Field, who would smile sadly when his name came up, sharing small, polite memories that barely scratched the surface. Gary always wanted to ask them if they knew what Rob had been carrying, if they had ever seen that shadow in his eyes the way he had. But he never did. Hollywood has an unspoken rule about grief, he said. You're allowed to mourn as long as you don't make anyone uncomfortable. There were nights when Gary would wake up from dreams in which Rob was still alive, sitting across from him at a quiet cafe, finally ready to tell him everything. In those dreams, Rob would start to speak, his voice gentle but urgent, and just as the truth was about to come out, Gary would wake up, heart racing, the words lost again. Those dreams became a kind of torment, a reminder of how close he had come to understanding, and how far away he still was. It wasn't until years later, when Gary himself faced a serious health scare, that something inside him shifted. Lying in a hospital bed, staring at the same kind of sterile ceiling Rob had stared at, he suddenly understood how terrifying it is to know your time might be limited. He felt a wave of regret so powerful it almost took his breath away. He realized that Rob hadn't been trying to confess something scandalous. He had been trying to make peace with his own story before it was too late. Gary said that's when he finally went through the boxes Rob's family had given him after the funeral. Inside were old letters, unfinished scripts, and a worn notebook filled with thoughts Rob had never shared with anyone. Reading those pages felt like hearing his voice again, but also like discovering a stranger. Rob had written about the pressure of always being the strong one, the successful one, the man who was supposed to have it all figured out. He had written about feeling like he was living two lives, one for the world, and one that he kept hidden even from the people he loved. Most point one passage, Gary said, still makes him feel like he's been punched in the chest. Rob had written that the hardest part of being admired is that people stop seeing when you're breaking. He had written about mistakes he made in his personal life, choices that hurt his family in ways he could never fully undo. He didn't name names, but he talked about long nights filled with regret, about wishing he had been braver in telling the truth while there was still time. As Gary read those words, he realized that Rob's last attempt to talk to him wasn't random. It was deliberate. Rob had chosen him because he trusted him, because he believed Gary would understand what it meant to carry something heavy in your soul while the world only sees your smile. That realization, Gary said, filled him with both honor and unbearable sorrow. Honor because Rob had trusted him. Sorrow because he had failed to listen when it mattered most, that he admitted that for a long time he was angry at himself, but also at the industry that had taught them both to hide. Hide your pain. Hide your weakness. Hide anything that might make you seem less than perfect. Rob had been a victim of that culture, just as much as he had been a master of it. And in the end, that culture had stolen his chance to be fully, honestly seen. Gary's voice dropped even lower as he said that there were people who knew pieces of Rob's truth, people who had been hurt by his silence, including members of his own family. He wouldn't betray their privacy by sharing everything, but he said enough to make one thing clear. Rob's life was far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than the polished Hollywood story ever suggested. He looked straight ahead again, eyes shining, and said that telling this story now feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that once he steps forward, there's no going back. But he also said that some truths demand to be told, no matter how much they hurt, because keeping them buried only creates more pain. The air felt heavy, charged with everything he still hadn't said, as if the next words might finally open the door Rob had been knocking on for so long that Gary's breathing had become uneven, the kind of quiet strained rhythm that happens when memories start pressing too hard against the present. He said that after reading Rob's notebook, he didn't sleep for days. Every page felt like a whispered plea from beyond the grave, asking him not to let those words fade into nothing. And yet, he was terrified. Terrified of hurting Rob's family, terrified of being misunderstood, terrified of shattering the beautiful, comforting image the world had of a man who had given them so much. So he did what Hollywood had taught him to do best. He stayed silent. Years went by, and that silence became its own kind of illness. Gary would be on set, surrounded by young actors who spoke about their dreams with the same hope Rob once had, and he would feel a sudden, sharp ache, knowing how quickly those dreams could turn into something lonely and complicated. He would see Rob's face in them sometimes, especially in the ones who tried too hard to be strong, and it made him want to scream a warning he wasn't allowed to give. He spoke about one night when he ran into an old friend of Rob's at a quiet restaurant, someone who had known him long before the fame, long before the pressure. Over glasses of wine, the conversation drifted to Rob, and for a moment the guard dropped. That friend admitted that Rob had struggled deeply with the weight of expectations, with mistakes he cowled. That as he reached this point, Gary's voice steadied just a little, as if he had finally found the courage he had been searching for all these years. He said that the truth he is carrying isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about understanding how even the brightest stars can feel unbearably alone, and how silence can be just as damaging as any lie. The room seemed to grow darker around him as he prepared to go deeper, to finally share the parts of Rob's story that had been hidden for so long, parts that would change everything people thought they knew. Gary leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, as though the weight of what he was about to say was physically pulling him down. He said there was one part of Rob's story that had haunted him more than anything else, something that explained so much of the sadness and distance that had marked his final years. It wasn't a scandal in the tabloid sense, but it was a wound that never healed. Rob had written about a moment early in his career when he had been forced to choose between his ambition and his family, between a life that looked perfect on screen and a life that was quietly falling apart at home. He spoke about how Rob had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary, irreplaceable moments because he was chasing the next project, the next chance to prove himself. At the time, everyone told him that was the price of greatness. But in the quiet of his later years, that price felt unbearable. Rob had written about watching his children grow up through photographs and phone calls, about feeling like a guest in his own home. Those words, Gary said, were filled with a regret so deep it almost felt like grief for a life that could never be lived again. There was also something Rob never said out loud but hinted at again and again in his writing, a fear that he had passed his own pain on to the people he loved. He worried that his silence, his emotional distance, had created wounds in his family that no amount of success could heal. Gary said reading those passages made him think about his own life, his own relationships, and the ways he had sometimes chosen work over the people who mattered most. In Rob's pain, he saw a reflection of himself, and that realization was terrifying. Gary admitted that there were moments when he wanted to tear up those pages, to pretend he had never seen them, because they were too honest, too raw. But he couldn't. They felt like a final conversation Rob had never gotten to have. And now, all these years later, Gary was the only one who could speak for him. He described visiting Rob's grave alone one rainy afternoon, the world quiet and gray, and reading those words out loud as if Rob could hear him. He apologized for not being there when Rob tried to open up, for not pushing past his own fear to truly listen. He told Rob that he would carry his truth, even if it broke him, even if people didn't understand. Yes, he spoke. Gary's eyes filled with tears again, and this time he let them fall. He said that one of Rob's last wishes, written in shaky handwriting, was that his family would know how much he loved them, even if he hadn't always known how to show it. That wish, Gary said, is what finally convinced him that staying silent was no longer an option. Love, even when it's imperfect, deserves to be seen. That he also spoke about how other actors who had known Rob had reached out over the years, quietly sharing their own memories, their own regrets. Some of them, like a now-aging Billy Crystal, admitted that they too had sensed Rob's pain but didn't know how to help. hearing that made Gary realize how many people have been circling around the same unspoken truth, each of them afraid to be the first to say it out loud. The truth, Gary said softly, is that Rob Reiner wasn't just a legendary filmmaker. He was a man who carried a lifetime of love, fear, and regret inside him. And those things were just as much a part of his story as any movie he ever made. And now, with the end of his own life no longer feeling so far away, Gary knows he can't keep pretending otherwise. The silence that followed felt almost sacred, like a pause before something final and irreversible. Gary lifted his eyes again, and for a moment they looked impossibly tired, as if every year of his life was sitting behind them. He said the reason this truth hurts so much is because it doesn't come with villains or heroes, just people who loved each other and still managed to wound one another. Rob had once told him, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, that the most painful thing about success was realizing it couldn't fix what was already broken inside you. At the time, Gary hadn't understood. Now he did. He spoke about how Rob's family had slowly begun to heal in their own quiet ways, but how there were still questions that never got answered, apologies that never got spoken. Gary said he often imagines what it would have been like if Rob had lived just a little longer, if he had found the strength to say everything he wanted to say. Maybe the wounds would have closed. Maybe they wouldn't. But at least the truth would have had a chance. That Gary's voice softened as he described how he sometimes feels Rob's presence when he's alone, like a familiar shadow in the corner of the room. He talks to him then, telling him about the movies he's made, the mistakes he's still trying to forgive himself for, the way getting older makes you see your past with a clarity that's both beautiful and brutal. He tells Rob that he's finally ready to stop hiding, even if it means letting people see the cracks, that he said that what he's Herring now isn't meant to rewrite history, but to deepen it. To remind people that even the men who seem larger than life are still just men, capable of loving deeply and hurting deeply in return. Rob Reiner's legacy, he said, isn't just in the stories he told on screen, but in the quiet, complicated story he lived off. Gary leaned back, his face calm but heavy with emotion. He said that speaking these words feels like closing a door that has been open for far too long. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it a shape, a place to finally rest. And somewhere, he likes to believe, Rob is listening, no longer afraid, no longer silent. The room fell into a gentle, aching stillness, the kind that comes after a long confession, when all that's left is the truth and the fragile hope that it might somehow bring a little peace. Gary sat in that silence for a long time after the camera stopped, as if he were afraid that moving too soon might make everything he had just said disappear. When he finally spoke again, his voice was almost tender. He said that telling Rob's story this way felt like finally letting a long-held breath go, even though it still hurt with every exhale. He imagined Rob somewhere beyond all the noise and expectations of the world, finally free of the pressure that had followed him for so long. Finally able to be just himself without fear of disappointing anyone. That he talked about how grief changes you, how it slowly teaches you what really matters. Fame fades, awards collect dust, but the love you didn't express and the truths you didn't share stay with you like ghosts. He said that if Rob's story means anything now, it's a reminder to be brave with the people you love while you still can, to speak even when your voice is shaking, to choose honesty over the illusion of perfection. Gary admitted that he will probably carry this ache for the rest of his life, but he no longer sees it as a punishment. He sees it as proof that what he and Rob shared was real, that their friendship, imperfect and unfinished as it was, still mattered. And in a strange, quiet way, that gives him peace. As he stood up to leave, he looked back one last time at the empty chair across from him, the place where he always imagined Rob sitting. He smiled sadly and whispered a thank you, not just for the movies, but for the moments in between, for the laughter and the pain and the complicated, beautiful truth of being human. And as the room faded into darkness, it felt like a story had finally been told the way it was meant to be, not as a legend, but as a heartfelt, aching goodbye that would echo long after the screen went black.